Yeah, welcome to the Tech Talks by Microsoft EMEA. We will start in 30 seconds, so stay tuned. In 30 seconds, we will start with our content. You can already use the comments in the chat functionality to give me feedback about audio video quality, to send in your questions about the topic if there are questions, and we will start with our content in 30 seconds. Welcome to the Tech Talk by Microsoft EMEA. Today our topic is Azure Stack HCI, the concept and the benefits. My name is Manfred Helber. I'm a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional in the category Cloud and Data Center. So my main focus areas are Windows Server, technologies like clustering, storage spaces direct, and also Azure Stack HCI, because it also belongs to the Cloud and Data Center topics. Let's have a look at our topic today. And I mentioned it already at a short intro before we started. You can use the chat functionality on YouTube to send in your comments, to send in your questions. So if you have any questions about this topic, feel free to write them down and I will answer your questions live in this live stream here at the Tech Talk session. Let's first talk about the HCI part in Azure Stack HCI, because we have two important topics here in Azure Stack HCI. The first one is Azure. We'll talk about this in a few minutes. And we have the hyperconverged infrastructure in Azure Stack HCI. And the hyperconverged infrastructure, it's great to use this HCI technologies to modernize a data center. Because when we are thinking about the traditional stack, we can see on the left-hand side, and we can see there are SAN and NAS systems. There are storage fabric switches. There are servers that provide our hypervisor layer for virtual machines. We have the network appliances and so on. So a very complex stack with many different hardware components we have to care about. And the important thing about this is that we need dedicated knowledge for each of these systems. So there are SAN systems from many different vendors in the market, fabric switches from many different vendors in the market. And when we are thinking about a hyperconverged infrastructure, then we can see this stack is reduced because in a hyperconverged infrastructure, we are using industry standard servers. The advantage is that we can use latest technology as soon as this technology is in the market, because this new technology has not to be adapted for a proprietary storage solution. It's available typically in the industry standard servers. So latest PCI Express technology, non-volatile memory express, persistent memory, and things like this. So we have an advantage of faster hardware adoption. We have the advantage of an reduced stack that's typically cheaper to implement at the customer side, and it is full redundant and powerful because it uses a powerful software layer. In the Microsoft technology stack, the technologies that are used are storage spaces direct for software-defined storage and Hyper-V for compute virtualization. So we're using these industry standard servers. We are running a powerful software stack on it. And Azure Stack HCI can start with minimum 2 nodes. So it's always a cluster. It's a highly available implementation. It's a fully redundant implementation. Can start with 2 servers, and it can scale up to 16 servers in a cluster. We can have several of these Azure Stack HCI clusters, but in one cluster, we have the maximum scalability of 16 servers. Important, we have the Azure in the name, but Azure Stack HCI is installed locally on our physical hardware in our data center, in our environment. So we are using this industry standard OEM servers. Important is to use an Azure Stack HCI certified solution, but nearly every OEM has an Azure Stack HCI certified solution in his portfolio. You can find the certified solutions on microsoft.com/HCI in the Azure Stack HCI catalog. And actually, we have more than 480 different certified solutions for Azure Stack HCI. So it runs on our on-premises, the Azure Stack HCI. It's a bare metal operating system, so it runs bare metal in our environment. From the graphical user interface, it looks like a server core installation. So when you install Azure Stack HCI, you will see this look and feel. It looks very similar to what you know from server core installations in Windows Server operating system. The hypervisor is always Hyper-V. This is important to understand because Hyper-V is a very, very powerful hypervisor, and Hyper-V is also the hypervisor that is used in Azure, it's used on the Windows client, it's used in Windows Server, and it's used on Azure Stack HCI. And Hyper-V is compatible with Windows client operating systems, with Windows Server operating system, also previous versions. So if you want to use a previous Windows Server version, it's compatible with Hyper-V and Azure Stack HCI. And for sure, also many Linux distributions in the market are officially supported for Hyper-V. For management, we can use the Windows Admin Center. We will see the Windows Admin Center in a live demo in a few minutes. For sure, we can use the PowerShell for automation. We can use System Center Virtual Machine Manager if we want to manage Azure Stack HCI on a larger scale. And we have the traditional tools like Hyper-V Manager, Failover Cluster Manager, and so on we can still use here. So when we start with industry standard servers, it's important to know a little bit more about the required disk layout, because it's important to have servers with an identical disk layout in each node. And here is an example. This is not the only possible configuration. This is an example how the 3-node cluster could be configured. In this example, we are running SSDs as cache drives in each node. And important is to have identical disk layout, to have the same number and type of these drives. So we have SSDs in each server, and these SSDs will be used as cache drives in this specific configuration. On the next slide, we will see many different possible configurations that can be used with Azure Stack HCI, but we have always the situation that the layout for each server has to be identical. So if we have one server with 4 hard disk drives, every server has to have 4 hard disk drives. So disk layout identical between the servers, so same number and type of drives. We can use hard disk drives, SSDs, NVMEs, persistent memory. Azure Stack HCI automatically optimizes the usage of the drives. So here in this scenario, Azure Stack HCI decided to use the SSD drives as cache drives to optimize the throughput to the hard disk drives. We can also run flash-only configurations. We can mix SSDs and NVMEs. It's not possible to work with hard disk drives only. So we have always a piece of cache if we are running traditional hard disk drives. And if we have a flash-only configuration, it depends on our needs. It depends on our configuration if we are working with cache or without cache. So in a flash-only configuration, it's possible to work without cache drives. So on the next slide, we have some possible configurations. Important, we have an OR between here. Does not mean server 1, server 2, server 3, but it means we have all the servers with the disk layout number 1. Or we have all servers with the layout we have here, number 2 or 3, and so on. We can have more than these drives. This is always the minimum configuration we see here. A typical server with 2 CPU sockets that is used for these scenarios typically has something like 26 drives that are possible per node. But there are also configurations in the market with less drives and with more drives. This is the minimum from a technical perspective. So we could run an NVMe only configuration. This means we have minimum 2, maximum 16 servers with only NVMe drives. Advantages: it's ultra fast, it's very powerful. Maybe the disadvantage could be the costs. It depends on your prices you receive from your OEM partner, but usually the NVMEs are the most expensive storage technology actually in the market per gigabyte because they are ultra fast. We could decide to go for the SSDs. SSD is also flash only, but usually it's a little bit cheaper than NVMe. Very powerful. So you have to compare the performance values like IOPS per second and throughput and the costs per gigabyte to decide, because maybe it could also be a decision to mix NVMEs and SSDs to optimize the costs and have a very, very good performance. The option number 2, the configuration version in the middle here on the slide with NVMEs and SSDs, means that the NVMEs will be cache drives and the SSDs will be used for capacity. We can mix NVMEs and hard disks to accelerate the hard disk drives and use the NVMEs for cache. We could also use the SSD and hard disk combination for good performance with optimized costs. And the last option is a multi-tier configuration. Here, the NVMEs will be used for caching, and the SSDs and the hard disk drives will provide hybrid disks for the capacity layer. The last option is the most complex configuration. It's the most flexible configuration. Actually, I don't really know an OEM partner that provides this configuration. It would be possible, but I think the prices of the hard disk drives and the SSDs are so close to each other that maybe the last option is interesting from the technical perspective, but nothing we would build in a production environment. If in your specific scenario this makes sense because you decide for some NVMe cache capacity and maybe only a few SSDs for accelerating the capacity layer, then this is possible from the technical perspective. When we are using persistent memory modules, we cannot use hard disk drives any longer, but for sure with persistent memory, we can also combine NVMEs and SSDs. So when we have a short look at the full stack, then we can see we have our servers here for easier visualization of the stack. We don't have the cache drives in the server layer here, but we have it on an additional layer. So for sure, they are all in the same slot layer. They are all in the same chassis, but we have here the hard disk drives. We have here the cache drives, and they are bound to each other on the logical layer, but we don't have a specific cabling. This is what I wanted to explain. So these drives are in the same chassis. This here builds a server. This is server number 1. And this server has some disk drive slots, and 6 of them are occupied with disk drives, 4 with hard disk drives, 2 with NVMe drives. So we have these 3 servers, and when we are writing data to this Azure Stack HCI configuration here, let's say we have a virtual machine here, then this virtual machine will read and write data to this stack. Then we can see, okay, it's fully redundant. Also, the cache is redundant because we write the data 3 times, not in a sequential workload, but at the same time. So we have this storage spaces, the storage bus layer. This storage spaces layer spans across all the servers in the storage spaces direct cluster. It's a logical layer. There's no physical cabling except the network between the servers. and the data is written distributed across the servers. Storage Spaces Direct distributes the data across the servers with two-way mirror in a two-node configuration, three-way mirror in a three-node configuration, and three-way mirror or dual parity in 4 and more nodes. So if we have 5, 6, 7, 8 nodes, we still have the three-way mirror and additionally the dual parity. In a two-node configuration, we have the two-way mirror. So we have one copy on server 1 and the second copy on server 2. Additionally, we have the nested two-way mirror. This means that we have a copy across the servers, and we have also a local copy. So this means that if one server fails, we can survive additional disk drive failures on the remaining servers. Let's have a look at such an Azure Stack HCI configuration. I have here a Windows Admin Center. So we are looking at the Windows Admin Center here. And I have several Azure Stack HCI configurations here in this Windows Admin Center. There's a two-node cluster. This is the 20. There's a three-node cluster. This is the 30. The four-node cluster, the 40, was expanded to a five-node cluster. So this is the reason why we will see 5 nodes here when we have a look at this cluster. Let's first go to the Azure Stack HCI cluster 20. So I will connect to this cluster, and what we can see here is Windows Admin Center, our management tool. We don't have to license it separately. It's included, so we can use this Windows Admin Center to configure Azure Stack HCI and to manage Azure Stack HCI and to monitor the Azure Stack HCI configuration here. So I have interesting values here like CPU usage, memory usage, the used storage on the right-hand side. I have information about the IOPS and the latency in my configuration. And for sure, I can go for the drives and see how many drives are in there. Here in the inventory, I will see, okay, there are drives. I will group these drives by server. This is possible to group by server. And then we can see, okay, I have 2 servers. I have a 2-node configuration, and I have 4 drives in each of the servers. We have seen this is possible in the flash-only configurations, for example, with SSDs or hard disk drives. Here you can see this is hard disk, but you can also see these are virtual disks. So this is because I'm working in a virtualized demo environment here. So this is a specific situation where we can configure Azure Stack HCI. For production environment, this is not supported in this configuration. So let's go to the summary. Here we can see, okay, I have 27 terabytes available, 3.96 terabytes in use, reserve is 7.881 terabyte. I could switch to the volumes and go for inventory, and I could create a new volume. Let's create a new volume here in the Windows Admin Center, volume 02. And you can see the different resiliency types: two-way mirror, nested two-way mirror, nested mirror, accelerated parity. The two-way mirror means copy on each server. The nested two-way mirror means a copy on each server on their local copy. And the nested mirror accelerated parity means a copy on each server and locally, additionally, a single parity configuration to survive additional failures. I would choose the two-way mirror. And for sure, if I have 4 copies, I will see if I create a 1 terabyte volume, I need 4 terabytes on my disk drive, on my disk drives, on my physical layer. So let's create the volume here. And we will see this volume 02 in a few seconds. This uses a nested two-way mirror configuration. So actually the volume is created. The Windows Admin Center also shows us the status, so we can always see how far the process is. So now we can see the volume 02, size is 1 terabyte, nested two-way mirror. When I check the volume, then I will see, okay, the size is 1 terabyte and the footprint is 4 terabyte. I think for everybody who has worked with RAID configurations before, it's clear to you that for 4 copies, I need a footprint that is 4 times the size I will be able to use. This is exactly what we can see here. If I'm using a two-way mirror, like I did it in volume 1, for sure, I only have a footprint of twice the size here. This volume is 2 terabytes, and I have a footprint of 4 terabytes, something like this here. It's 2 copies there. So we have seen the drives, the volumes. You can see you have many, many more tools here in the Windows Admin Center. So the Windows Admin Center is our management and maintenance tool for storage spaces direct for the HCI part. So this was the first part. If you have questions about this HCI part, feel free to ask these questions in the chat, and I will answer these questions in the show. The second part is Azure, because we can see here Azure Stack HCI has Azure in the name. And this is for me the game changer in everything we had before in on-premises infrastructure, because Azure Stack HCI natively integrates with Azure. So we have our Azure Active Directory, we have our Azure subscription and our resource group in Azure, and the Azure Stack HCI is connected there. Important is to keep in mind or to know that it's not required to have a 24 hours, 7 hours a day, 7 hours, 7 days a week connectivity. So if the Azure Stack HCI is disconnected from Azure, all my services will keep up and running. For sure, if you have a hybrid configuration where you need services from Azure and these services are not available, then you will not be able to use them. But regarding the Azure Stack HCI, the capacity, the volumes we had to look on, the local running virtual machines, everything stays up and running also when our connectivity to Azure is lost. If we have some issues with the connectivity, I will show you this in a few minutes in another live demo in detail how this exactly works. From the architecture, we can see that the Azure Stack HCI nodes will use a local service and local hyper-converged infrastructure service that collects data about the Azure Stack HCI and sends this data to Azure because Azure Stack HCI has a consumption-based billing. So we don't have to buy an Azure Stack HCI license. There is no Azure Stack HCI license with a price of X dollars. We have a consumption-based subscription for Azure Stack HCI, and the costs are calculated based on the number of physical cores in the node. This means this hyperconverged infrastructure service looks on every node and checks the number of active physical cores, and these cores are reported to Azure for billing. The costs are $10 per core per month, per physical core, per active physical core. So Azure does not know about your physical cores you have bought for the server. It only knows about the active physical cores. So let's imagine each of these servers we see here has 20 physical cores. So 10 in each socket, 20 cores in each server. This means 60 cores in this cluster. Now, maybe you have only 50% you need for your workload. So you could go to the firmware of the server and deactivate cores. Let's imagine we deactivate 10 cores on each server. So we have 20 cores in each server, 60 overall, but we only have 30 active cores. Then we are charged for the 30 cores and not for the 60. Important is to deactivate the cores. If you don't use the cores, you are still charged for them because Azure sees this amount of cores, and this will be the basis for the billing process. If you need additional CPU power at a later point of time, you can activate additional cores, then your Azure costs will increase based on the number of cores, and you will have additional resources for additional workload. so pay-per-use like we know it from Azure. Azure Stack HCI is also provided in a new version once a year. So actually, we have the Azure Stack HCI version 21H2. The last one was 20H2, and we will see a new version also this year. This is what we expect. So the version 2020 HX, I would expect it's in 2020 H2, so the next version for Azure Stack HCI. These new versions are included because you have a subscription. You don't have to buy this new version. You just use this. The upgrade is very, very easy. We have a cluster aware update feature. I can show you this in one of my next live demos directly at the system. And also an advantage is that you will receive support via Azure because it's not included the support. You have to book it as an additional option. But the support, you can see it starts with $29 per month. For production environments, it's $100, but not $100 per node or $100 per cluster. It's $100 per customer. So the customer that's running Azure Stack HCI subscribes to this Azure standard support. This is $100 per month. And this means you get the full support for your Azure Stack HCI cluster from the Azure product support team. So let's have a look at this Azure integration part. I will switch to my live demo environment. We had this cluster here. We have created a volume. We used the Windows Admin Center for management. And when I select the dashboard here, I can see everything is healthy, everything is fine. And directly on the dashboard, I can see the Azure connectivity status is connected. So this cluster is connected to Azure. Okay, let's look for more details. When we go to settings at the end of the tools list, on the left-hand side of the screen, we have the tools. And at the end of the tools list, we have the settings. And in the settings, we have the Azure Stack HCI area. So we have Azure Stack HCI registration, monitoring data, and so on. So these are the specific settings exclusively available for the Azure Stack HCI operating system. So let's check the Azure Stack HCI registration. Now here we can see, okay, my cluster is registered to Azure. This is important to unlock the full functionality to, let's say, activate all the features for Azure Stack HCI. So one of the first steps when we installed Azure Stack HCI and when we configured our cluster will be to register this Azure Stack HCI cluster in Azure. Now we can use additional Azure benefits. Now we have the situation that the workload sees Azure when the workload is running on the Azure Stack HCI cluster. And we have the situation that Azure Stack HCI checks the connectivity every day. So here we can see my last connectivity check was today at 9 a.m. This means for the next 30 days, I am safe with the Azure connectivity. So if I lose the connectivity here, I will still able to run my virtual machines tomorrow. I will be able to access my storage. I will be able to use all the Azure Stack HCI features that are provided by my local hardware. If my internet connectivity is available tomorrow, then I will here see the 70th, then the 18th, the 19th, and so on. Every day it tries to connect to Azure to upload the number of cores for the billing, because I mentioned it's a consumption-based billing and it's on a daily basis. So if I reduce the amount of cores today, my Azure consumption will be reduced tomorrow because I have less cores that are reported to Azure. If I have a disconnected status here, I will not get any error or warning in the first and the second day. After 3 days where I'm not connected, I will see a warning here that says, oh, you should find out if you have a technical issue. If this is a planned disconnectivity, everything is fine, but it's not planned. You should ensure that you will have a connectivity within the next 27 days, because maximum 30 days we can be disconnected. What happens if we are disconnected more than 30 days? Our existing workload will still stay online, will still function completely. So we will never see a outage of a virtual machine or a volume. Everything is still available. But if we are disconnected more than 30 days, then we will have the situation that we are not able to create new workloads. So we cannot create any new virtual machines. We cannot bring any new containers to Azure Stack HCI here. So we have an additional thing here. We have the Azure Arc integration status. Azure Stack HCI 21H2, starting with this version, automatically enabled all the nodes for Azure Arc. This means I have direct access to these resources in Azure. So when I click here to view Azure resource, then a new tab opens in my Azure tenant, in my Azure subscription here. And after a few seconds, I can see, okay, I have an Azure Stack HCI cluster here. It's the D102 Azure Stack HCI cluster 20. I can see my two nodes, this one here. I can see the resource group. I can access the activity log, where I can see what was changed on this resource. I can use the access control to define who has access to these resources. We can configure additional tags, for example, information about the location or technical parameters. We can use diagnose and solve problems. Maybe I have some issue with this cluster. I could use the diagnose to see what's going wrong here. I can use Azure Arc. So important, here we are actually in the Azure portal. This is the Azure portal. This is not my locally installed Windows Admin Center. So this website is provided by Azure, and it's enabled to manage my on-premises resources. So I could decide to install additional extensions. So for example, a monitoring extension. I could send configurations to my on-premises Azure Stack HCI cluster. I could configure logs to ensure that nobody will accidentally delete something here. Now we have a absolutely new part. You can read it's in preview here. We have also the ability to manage virtual machines, virtual networks, disks, and VM images from the Azure portal on our on-premises environment. This means in the traditional management, we are using Windows Admin Center to create new virtual machines, to create virtual networks. But let's imagine you have a hybrid thinking company that has running some virtual machines in Azure, some virtual machines on premises. Then I could use the Azure portal to deploy virtual machines. And when you deploy a virtual machine, you decide this should be deployed in the Azure public cloud, or this should be deployed on one of my Azure Stack HCI clusters I'm running on premises. And at the bottom of this list, you can see the monitoring logs, the tasks. This is also preview for automation. And we have the support requests. So if you have an issue, you can start here your support request directly based on your support plan you have booked. So this integration is really great. And this is one part I mentioned that Azure Stack HCI is a game changer where many things change, because we don't, in the future, we will not think about Azure and on-premises and see this as different worlds. Azure Stack HCI really enables the hybrid thinking and the hybrid working, because in the future, it doesn't make a difference if I want to deploy the virtual machine on premises or in Azure, because I'm able to use the same portal, to use the same images, to use the same powerful deployment tools. What's important to understand about Azure Stack HCI, I mentioned this in the live demo a few minutes ago. Azure Stack HCI acts like Azure. So if I'm running a virtual machine on Azure, this virtual machine, if I'm running a virtual machine on Azure Stack HCI, this virtual machine thinks the machine is running in Azure, because Azure Stack HCI is Azure. It's Azure on premises. And we already have several Azure workloads and benefits on premises, and we will see many more of these workloads on premises. So important when I'm speaking about, we will see more workloads on premises on Azure Stack HCI. This is always my opinion. I'm not a Microsoft employee. I'm a Microsoft most valuable professional. So I'm working very close to these products. I'm evaluating the technology behind this, and I have some ideas what would be great to have on Azure Stack HCI. And today we already have the Windows Server operating system with advantages like extended security updates. I will explain you this later. With the extended security updates, you will receive additional updates for free, even if your product is out of the extended support time frame. In the Windows Server on Azure Stack HCI, we can use the Azure Stack HCI exclusive Windows Server 2022 Data Center Azure Edition. This Azure Edition is only available on Azure Stack HCI and in the Azure Data Center in the public cloud. So Windows Server 2022 Data Center Azure Edition has some exclusive features like faster networking with SMB over QUIC, hot patching with updating servers without a full restart. So we have a reduced restarting time to ensure that our workload keeps up and running. And the Data Center Azure Edition is only available on platforms that are Azure, and Azure Stack HCI is Azure. We have the Azure Kubernetes services. If you want to use this powerful container orchestration tool we know from Azure, we have the platform as a service components like the managed SQL app services, functions, logical apps we know from Azure, Azure Stack HCI. On the right-hand side, we can see Azure Virtual Desktop, like platform as a service services. This is also still in preview, so this means we don't have this in our available for our production environment. Only for special customers with additional contracts with Microsoft, they already can use it in production in a supported scenario. Everybody can test the Azure Virtual Desktop because it's a public preview. It's not an internal preview, so you can use this and run the powerful Azure Virtual Desktop on your Azure Stack HCI environment. These are the Azure workloads we already have or we will receive on Azure Stack HCI. But with Azure Stack HCI, we will also see Azure management and governance improvements. So we already have in Azure, and we will be able to have this also in Azure Stack HCI, like the monitoring from Azure. This is already available. The management via Azure Arc. Auto manage, this is available in Azure, where Microsoft cares about the updates and the security of your systems. This will be also available in the future on Azure Stack HCI. The disaster recovery with Azure Site Recovery is available, the PowerShell connectivity, and so on. So it's not only workloads, it's also the management and platform advantages of Azure we can use on premises with our Azure Stack HCI. And the third area where we have advantages of the improvements from Azure is the Azure infrastructure innovations. In Azure, we have many technologies driven by this high-scale data center needs you have in Azure. With Azure Stack HCI, we will see several of these things also on premises. For example, the kernel soft reboot for an ultra-fast restart after patching a node, or the GPU support, even as an GPU support with GPU pooling in clusters, or the dynamic GPU CPU compatibility if you have cluster nodes with different CPU configurations and where you want to have a compatibility. I don't know if you know how this works in HyperV today. In HyperV today, we have the situation that for this CPU compatibility, HyperV is looking for the compatibility between the CPUs in reducing the CPU features to a minimum, to an absolute minimum to provide the compatibility. In Azure Stack HCI version 21H2, HyperV looks at the nodes and builds the maximum feature set that is compatible between all the nodes. We have the thin provisioning for volumes in Azure Stack HCI. We have network ATC, the technical configuration based on templates that eases the deployment of these environments. And we have the secured core server configuration. Secured core server means that we have a server with a trusted platform module, with secure boot, with encryption of the drives, and so on. So it's an huge advantage if you are caring about the security of your environment. So let's have another look at my demo system here to see a little bit more about this Azure innovations on Azure Stack HCI. When we are looking at this Azure part, at this Azure Stack HCI part, in the tools list in the settings again, then we can see we have here the Azure Stack HCI registration. We talked about this. And we have also a part that is called Azure Benefits. Let's select the Azure Benefits. In the Azure Benefits section, we can enable our Azure Stack HCI cluster to provide this additional Azure functionalities for virtual machines on this cluster. So we have two areas. The first one is cluster. The second one is VMs. So the first step is to enable the cluster for the Azure Benefits. And we can see here, this cluster, Azure Benefits are turned on both nodes. And actually, the Azure Benefits expire at 15th of June. Why on 15th of June? Yesterday, this cluster checked for the Azure Benefits at Azure. And now I have the 30 days till I need a recheck if this Azure Benefits will be available for my cluster. We will have this check every day. So if there's a disconnected situation for a few days, this doesn't make any problems because it checks again tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. So we will have reduced functionality here regarding the Azure Benefits if we are disconnected more than 30 days. And for sure, I can also sync with Azure to trigger a sync now and tell this cluster, please check now for the Azure Benefits. But usually you don't do this manually. Usually you will say, okay, I checked for the Azure Benefits, the cluster checked for the Azure Benefits, and now I have them for the next 30 days. And then I will be able to activate the Azure Benefits for dedicated virtual machines. This means as soon as I activate the Azure Benefits, I can, for example, use the Data Center Azure Edition if I have a license that allows me to use the Data Center Azure Edition. Or I can use the extended security updates if I have licenses that allow me to run virtual machines with Windows Server operating system. Because this is important to understand, Azure Stack HCI comes without virtual Windows Server usage rights. This means you have costs per physical core per month for the infrastructure, for the Azure Stack HCI, for the technology storage spaces direct, for the technology for virtualizing workloads, and so on. If you are running only virtual machines with Linux or with Linux-based containers, you will not have any additional costs regarding the operating system licensing from Microsoft because you are not running a Microsoft operating system. So I must admit, I'm not a Linux pro, I'm a Windows Server professional. So for me in a data center, I always have Windows Server workloads. This means I have a few Windows servers, or usually I have many Windows servers. And if I have many Windows servers, I need additional licenses for these server systems for the physical hardware. Typically, you would use Windows Server 2022 data center. It can be an OEM license, it can be a volume license, it can be CSP. And if we use these traditional licensing ways, then we have a scenario that is called bring your own license. So bring your own license means we already have licenses or we are buying new licenses and we bring these licenses to Azure Stack HCI. These Windows Server licenses we need for Azure Stack HCI are licensed based on the traditional licensing requirements. So if you attended the previous tech talks, you have been in the tech talk where we had some information about Windows Server licensing. And there we talked about that Windows Server is licensed per physical core, per host. The minimum requirement is 16 cores. So even if the server has less cores, we have to license 16 cores, but we always have to license all the cores in the physical server. This means if we have a server with 20 cores, we have to license 20. If we have a server with, let's say, 32 cores, we have to license 32 cores. If our server has 8 cores, we have to license 16 cores. If we disable cores, this reduces the costs for Azure Stack HCI, but not for the Windows Server licenses because the minimum is 16 cores. With Bring Your Own License, we can use our existing licenses or our new license in combination with automatic virtual machine activation on our Azure Stack HCI cluster. But there's also a new option. It's the Windows Server subscription. Windows Server subscription means I'm paying for the Windows Server usage based on my physical cores of the host. Let's have a look at this configuration on my cluster. We talked about the Azure benefits. Now I will switch to the Activate Windows Server VMs. I want to see how I can activate Windows Server virtual machines here. So we will see two options. I will set up the activation of the virtual machines. The first one is to have a subscription similar to the Azure Stack HCI subscription. The second one is using my existing licenses. Let's first check the use existing Windows Server licenses. When I go to next, I will have here in this 2-node cluster, 2 fields to enter my product keys, my data center product keys I bought for this Azure Stack HCI nodes. In a 3-node cluster, I have 3 of these fields, 4-node cluster, 4 fields, and so on, because I need a data center key for each node to show Azure Stack HCI, oh, there's a valid license, and to enable Azure Stack HCI for automatic virtual machine activation. So the virtual machines are activated based on the automatic virtual machine activation key I will provide inside the virtual machine. So this is the traditional option. It's there, it's interesting for many existing customers. Let's choose for the other option, purchase Windows Server subscription. Let's go to next. Now I can see, okay, This means I have in this cluster 4 physical cores totally, and I will have costs of 4 cores multiplied with the costs per core. I already mentioned we have costs per Azure Stack HCI core of $10 per core per month. So this means for the Azure Stack HCI infrastructure, I'm paying for this cluster $40 per month. Now let's check what the VM workload will cost. The VM workload is also based on the core, on the physical core. So when I move this to my screen here, this is the Azure Stack HCI pricing page. It's available via azure.microsoft.com. And here we have the information about the Azure Stack HCI OS itself, per physical core per month. And we have the Windows Server subscription for the guests. It's $23.30 per physical core per month. It's also per physical core, not per vCPU, and it provides an unlimited amount of virtual machines. So I have 4 cores, so I have 4 times this $23.30 here. Additionally, the $10 per core for the infrastructure. And with this licensing, I can run as many virtual machines on this cluster as my hardware is able to provide for my customers, for my users. This is important. The Azure Stack HCI cannot be used to provide single virtual machines to different customers. So I cannot use Azure Stack HCI in a hosting scenario where I'm running virtual machines for different customers. Each Azure Stack HCI has to belong to one customer. This is because of the relationship to Azure, where we have a connectivity to Azure here. So 2 options for providing the Windows Server usage rights for Azure Stack HCI. So I mentioned one of the advantages for Azure Stack HCI is the extended security updates inside the virtual machines. So when we look, for example, at Windows Server 2008, then we have the situation that since January 2020, we have the support end date here for the extended support. The next 2 Windows Server operating systems that will leave extended support will be Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2 in October 2023. And when we move our workload to Azure, we have extended security updates included. When you run on your traditional on-premises infrastructure, you have to pay for these extended security updates if you want to use them. In Azure Stack HCI, the extended security updates are also included. So when we are running our workload on Azure Stack HCI, we are also able to provide these extended security updates for our virtual machines. How does this work? We have to enable the Azure benefits. We have seen this in my live demo environment. Here, this is the screen when the Azure benefits have not been activated so far. And then we can turn the Azure benefits on. This is the initial step. And when we turn on the Azure benefits, we have the hyperconverged infrastructure service on our nodes that receives a certificate from Azure, because you have somehow to ensure that your workload really runs on Azure Stack HCI and not on a different platform where you maybe think it's Azure Stack HCI or something else. With this Azure Stack HCI cluster, the hyperconverged infrastructure service really shares a certificate with Microsoft Azure. So the certificate is provided, and this ensures that your Azure Stack HCI workload that thinks it's running in Azure really runs on an Azure Stack HCI and not on a different solution. So Azure Stack HCI is really a game changer here because it brings Azure to your on-premises environment based on your physical infrastructure you decide for. I mentioned we have several OEMs in the market that provide their certified systems for Azure Stack HCI. If you are interested in more details about Azure Stack HCI, you are invited to join the MEA Tech Talk on May the 23rd. This is today in 1 week, where we see how to deploy Azure Stack HCI, including a demo. Today we have seen in the demo several screens of the Windows Admin Center, how the Azure Stack HCI looks like. Next week we will see how to get such an Azure Stack HCI cluster configured. What are the required steps, where you have to care about, what you have to care about. 1 week later, on May the 30th, we have the management of Azure Stack HCI via Windows Admin Center. There we will go more in detail about the different configuration options, about how to configure virtual machines and things like this. And in June, we'll talk about Windows Server and Azure Virtual Desktop topics. So I'm looking forward to have you in the next Tech Talk sessions in May. And last week we had a Tech Talk support hour for your questions on May the 24th. We will have the next support hour. This is next week, Tuesday, where we have 1 full hour for your questions about Microsoft licensing, Microsoft technologies, and things like this. Today, the chat was open for you to ask your questions about Azure Stack HCI and the benefits here. We had 2 comments in the chat. And if you have questions, I will also show the question to the audience and answer your question. So feel free to send them in the last minutes. And I'm looking forward to have you in next Monday in the Tech Talk about configuring Azure Stack HCI, and next Tuesday in the Tech Talk support hour. So thank you for your time. Hope you enjoyed the session, and thanks for your feedback and your questions in your chat. Bye.